We'll come to open and turn the time over to Jaime.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the members of the review panel and the alternates and everyone who is here today. Thank you so much. Okay, so in today's live mapping demonstration, we're going to be using a mapping software. Again, there are multiple mapping softwares out there and available to the public. This is just one of them. They all, for the most part, will perform the same functions, and whoever the redistricting commission's consultants are, they'll use some form of redistricting software, certainly. Our world that we're redistricting today is Santa Clara County in California, of course. As Karin mentioned, the data that we're going to be using involves municipal geographies, for example, the county boundary and city boundaries. There will also be census geographies, census blocks, block groups, and tracts. We will go over those shortly. The underlying data that we're using is from the most recent census population numbers, the PL94 from the 2010 decennial census. And we will also be taking a brief peek at the American Community Survey CVAP, Citizen Voting Age Population figures for Santa Clara County. So before we begin, we are going to be creating some fictitious assembly districts and Senate districts. There will be 6 fictitious assembly districts and 3 fictitious Senate districts. The total population of Santa Clara County, according to the 2010 census, is 1,781,624 total population. So each of the 6 assembly districts, the population that we are aiming for will be 2,906,940. And for the Senate districts, we're going to be aiming for 593,881. So just a review really quick of what we're looking at to get everybody familiarized with the map that we're working with. And of course, the commission will be working with a map of the entire state of California. This is just one county. So this is the county boundary. All of these smaller gray polygons are census places. If we look at these green lines, these are census tracts. As you can see, there are census tracts that go all throughout the state of California. And these are just the tracts we'll be working with. Those are within the county of Santa Clara. Same with census block groups. These red lines delineate the boundaries of census block groups throughout California, and we'll just be working with the census block groups within Santa Clara County. And here are the census blocks. As you can see, there are very many of them in Santa Clara County. There are over 22,000 individual census blocks. And just a note about census blocks, these are created by the census and they are not uniform in size or shape whatsoever. Here's an example of one census block. That highlighted red area is one census block. Generally, in more rural areas, like here in eastern Santa Clara County, census blocks do tend to be much larger. And if we zoom into somewhere in San Jose, this is also one census block, this itty bitty. It is bounded by city streets, so it's not just one census block, but also one city block. And if we zoom out, we can see that we lose sight of it altogether. So there's a very, very large difference between how census blocks can look. So one trait that Karin touched on in terms of something that commissioners will need is patience. And the goal of this training is not to make everybody on the review panel expert line drawers, but to sort of give an example, give an idea rather of when line drawing, through the process of line drawing and determining where districts will actually lie, some of the traits that commissioners will need to possess. And to that effect, we are going to create a fictitious assembly district right now live. And we'll see some of the necessary traits. So we are going to start with census places. And I'm going to pull out a box. This is a tool that that this software provides. It shows the changes. Unfortunately, I can't make the text on this any larger, so pardon me. This will show the total population of this district. This, again, is the ideal value for our fictitious assembly district. And here's the percent deviation that we're working on. So if we choose one census place, we can see that we're still well below our percent deviation. So right now we're negative 83% of the total population that we're looking for one assembly district. So I'm going to keep adding a couple of census places. I know that up here is San Jose, which is going to be too large to be in one assembly district, so I'm not going to add that one. I will make this change. And I am going to now switch to census tract, which, if you remember the slide that Karin showed, census tract is the next biggest, or I'm sorry, the next smallest level of census geography. So I'm moving now to the census tracts, which again are these green outlines. And you can see this census tract we just selected is quite large. And zooming in again, now we're at negative 67%. Grabbing some more. So right now I'm making a square just to get everything that is a full census tract that's inside the area. Adding more and more census tracts. Oh, too much. So we just went over, so now we're 9%. I'm going to take some of these out. So this area we can see is much more densely populated than this large census tract. Okay, back to negative 32%. Let's move on to our census block groups as we're adding more. Keep clicking away till we're getting a little bit closer. Negative 16%. All right, negative 11%, and let's move on to our census tracts. Or census blocks, please excuse me. And if we zoom in close enough to our census blocks, labels pop up. This shows the population of every single person of every single census block. So this is as reported by the 2010 census. We see here in this block, there are 447 people. -8%. And if we keep going, we will get to -6%, closer and closer to 0. All right, and now we are almost within our 5% deviation as Ms. McDonald and Mr. Levitt mentioned. The Constitution guides that we want to be within 10% total deviation for each district. Sometimes we think of that as within plus 5% or minus 5% deviation. So right now we're here in 4.03%. So this, I'll make this change. So this large blue district is now within -4% deviation, although we have not looked at any other of the criteria that are needed. This, if we're only looking at total population, could be a district that complies with the population standards. If we go in further, we can try to get to something close to a congressional district. And again, this is demonstrating the patience that the commissioners will need. So now we're within 101 people of the ideal value if the assembly district and the congressional district were the same population. So, which of course is not going to be true. But if we were trying to balance this assembly district, or rather, if this assembly district was a congressional district and had a much stricter population guideline, then this is within 101 people. It's 0.03%. As you know, during the last redistricting, the commission went to plus or minus 1 person deviation. Many other states also followed those guidelines. It is unclear what population guideline this coming commission will follow for their congressional districts. But just based on this, you can imagine that narrowing into exactly 1 person plus or minus is going to require a lot of attention to detail while you're looking at the bigger picture of exactly where your district is, where you want it to go. And will also require a lot of flexibility in terms of, say that you really want your district to go across 7th Street, north on Broadway, and then, west on Webster, let's say. And you love those lines because they're really clear markers that are really easy to understand, but you just can't get there for population purposes. And unfortunately, you're going to need to cross 7th somewhere. So it's going to require that the commission can sort of keep an eye on the big picture, what they want all the districts to look like, but also maintain the flexibility to be able to say, okay, we know that in draft A, or in our first draft that's out in July 1st, we made this possible. Things have changed now, and unfortunately, these exact lines that we really liked can't be followed anymore. So we're going to need to be flexible and figure out where on 7th we can change, where on 7th we can make one census block of a change in one direction or another. So one thing I will note also, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this exercise in a more concentrated, a more densely populated area. But as you can see, this is one of This is one of 6 assembly districts in Santa Clara County. And so what that will indicate is that there's a lot of area that is not very densely populated, and areas maybe more in these cities where these census block boundaries are much smaller. Those will have much smaller districts geographically, but they'll still have the same population in them. So I'm going to take these districts off, and we're going to keep working with the census blocks. But we are really quickly going to take a look at ways that the commission will be able to analyze race and ethnicity pertaining to the mapping software. So I'm going to zoom in here to San Jose. And on each census block, the census blocks are all filled in, and these darker blue census blocks indicate that there are more people living within the census block, and this is total population. So there's more people living in the census blocks that are darker colored. These census blocks indicate that there's nobody living in there because they're more lightly colored. So this is sort of an example of population density. And for this, just for this exercise, we're just going to be looking at Latino population. So here, now we have the percent Latino population in each of the census blocks. So again, the census blocks that are colored in with a darker blue, those census blocks have a higher percentage Latino population than the blocks that are colored in a lighter blue. So of the people living in those census blocks, a higher percentage of that population of everybody living in the census block is Latino or identified as Latino on the census. So again, the total race and ethnicity breakdown will be from the census data set. And then moving on to voting age population, this is also provided by the PL 94. This is the, not a big change, the percent Latino voting age population in these blocks in these areas. And finally, the Latino citizen voting age population. So you can see that in the same area, depending on what data set we're looking at, we're just sort of looking, it's a different representation of the populations in that area. And the commission, again, the commission isn't a guiding factor of the redistricting, isn't that race should be a predominant criteria. It's like the example that Mr. Levitt gave of where you're not just staring at your speedometer and then driving without looking out your windshield, but you can sort of look at the speedometer. In this case, it might be where different populations live, different racial and ethnic groups live throughout the area that you're redistricting. So it's sort of like keep it in your awareness and avoid unnecessarily, intentionally splitting groups, while at the same time keeping in mind that that just because you know that there is a large percentage of a certain racial, or ethnic group residing in one area, that doesn't mean necessarily that in that neighborhood there's a cohesive neighborhood identity just because of who is living there or who happens to be living there. The way that the commissioners will get best districts is not going to be to assume that they know populations or understand populations throughout California, but rather their best districts will come from responsiveness to community input. So again, just because in this area, there, as compared to the rest of Santa Clara County or the rest of the city of San Jose even, there are large Latino populations living in this area. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a community of interest. However, if a community member comes and testifies and says, yes, this is my community of interest, there are a lot of, there's a shared cultural background, there's shared heritage here, then it would definitely be considered a community of interest. Are there any questions about that so far?
So we have a question from a public member. Please state your name for the record.
Sean Dugar with Common Cause. So the last go around, the public encouraged members of the commission to do the exact opposite of what you were saying. In LA, you had members of the African American community come together and say, you know what, we have established relationships and coalitions that go beyond race. So don't create a district that's 50% plus African American. Let us work in partnership with other communities. Do you see that in other places across the state?
Yes, definitely. And so there are many areas throughout the state where there will be multiple racial or ethnic groups cohabitating, or I guess living in the same areas. And this is a really good example of something that could be a community of interest. This particular example also could be a potential Voting Rights Act district should the commission choose to consider multiple ethnic groups voting together as a voting block, as opposed to just looking at one group at a time when they're analyzing for their Section 2 districts. Okay, thank you all for bearing with me through that exercise. Our next exercise, we're just gonna, I was going to talk about contiguity. However, I believe that just for the sake of time, Mr. Levitt and Ms. McDonald have also both gone over contiguity there and stole my examples of the Channel Islands. So both of them did. So we're just gonna move past contiguity and hopefully it's very clear from the two previous presentations, issues concerning contiguity. So moving on to our next criterion, which is geographies. Again, there are municipal geographies that will be handed to the commission from the census. Again, the county boundary and city boundaries, census place boundaries. And those are on the same level when you're considering redistricting as communities of interest. So I've created a couple fictitious communities of interest for us to consider while we are looking at a couple of drafts, that draft assembly districts that I've also created just to sort of get our creativity flowing when we're thinking about redistricting here. So some communities of interest are very large. Here's one community of interest, which is just parts of Silicon Valley. This is multiple cities large, so it's Stanford, Palo Alto, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, here we're seeing part of Milpitas, Los Altos, California, Loyola, part of Cupertino. So we're seeing here that communities of interest do not necessarily follow city boundaries or county boundaries. They oftentimes will split a city. So for example, is Milpitas, in case that wasn't clear. And you can see that it's split. by this community of interest. Moving on, here is Milpitas, part of Milpitas, plus some areas sort of along the 101 corridor. I will display some highways for you. Oh, I'm sorry. So it's along 680, and this is just part of San Jose. Perhaps this community of interest, members of the community came to speak on living along this 680 corridor and perhaps are dealing with similar issues related to housing. Some communities of interest, those were both large communities of interest. Some can be very small. So this community of interest is called Rose Garden. It is a neighborhood in San Jose. It's a historic neighborhood. And downtown San Jose, I should give a caveat that these are fictitious communities of interest that I made up, and anyone from Santa Clara County who disagrees with me, I totally understand. I don't live in Santa Clara County, and just trying my best to give some potential examples. So here's downtown San Jose. And here are a couple more. South San Jose, so this neighborhood, folks who live in this neighborhood are dealing with, potential development on the horizon. There's a lot of open spaces that perhaps the people who live in this community of interest are focused on protecting. South 101, these are a series of smaller cities that are positioned along the 101 corridor. There's a shared economic history in agriculture, and really these cities are different from the rest of Santa Clara County. They're really not involved in tech industry or Silicon Valley. It's more of a rural agricultural feel to these cities. And foothills, these are cities in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains, which run right along here. This is also a different feel from maybe more urban environments in Santa Clara County. They have more like quaint downtowns and more of a small town feel, even though they are in a county that maybe has a larger urban feel, or at least one very large city. And last but not least, this COI that we will be working with is Mountain View and Sunnyvale, parts of Mountain View and Sunnyvale together. So you can see it splits Mountain View and Sunnyvale, and perhaps the folks who live here are focused on getting a rec center for maybe this community feels really cohesive and they want to share a rec center where kids who live there can go after school to hang, get homework help, etc. So those are our communities of interest. And I will note that these two communities of interest, the Silicon Valley area and part of Milpitas and North San Jose, these are both too large in population to be whole in an assembly district. So we know for sure that these will be split. So bearing all of this in mind, I've made a couple drafts. This first draft focuses on keeping cities intact. So this is keeping all of the cities in Santa Clara County intact. However, the city of San Jose is split for population purposes. That is also too large to be in one whole in one assembly district. And these numbers here on this label, this represents the percent deviation of each of these districts. So ranges everywhere from -3% deviation to 1.67% deviation. So we know that all of the cities in this variation are intact. We feel really good about that, right? Maybe not once we consider what happened to our COIs. So we were so focused on keeping our cities intact that did we split the Foothills COI? Yes, we split this Foothills COI. Did we split? We know we didn't split the South 101 COI because these are just the geographically where they're located, less likely to get split because they're on the border. South San Jose COI, yes, we split this into 3 different districts. Our downtown COI, yes, also split into 2 districts. What about our teeny tiny Rose Garden COI? We even split this COI into 2 districts. And of course, communities of interest and cities and county boundaries are on the same level. They're not ranked within this criterion. And so this map would not be a good version to go with. What about our draft where we really just focused on keeping COIs intact? So in this version, all of the COIs that we have are intact, except of course for the Silicon Valley COI and the Milpitas and North San Jose COI, which we know are too large to be in any one assembly district. So we see here that we're well within our percent deviation. And so we want to see what happened to our census places. We know that San Jose is going to be split into multiple districts. And I'm just going to sort of go around like a clock. Here's little tiny Lexington Hills. We split that one. Los Altos. We split that city. Mountain View. Yes, it's split. Sunnyvale. Also split. Santa Clara, also split. Milpitas, yes, it is split. And East Foothills, yes, it is split. So we, as communities of interest, which I'll show a couple just to prove this one is whole. Foothills is all in one district. South San Jose in one district. Downtown in one district, little tiny Rose Garden COI in one district. So although all of our COIs are sort of protected in this version, we do not have our cities intact. So this would also not be an advisable draft. Moving on to our final draft. This draft has all of our cities and all of our COIs intact. And of course, if we were on a statewide level, we would also be considering counties. And I would just like to note that this is the draft that also uses the highest percent deviation in order to keep all of our COIs and all of our cities intact. And so as a result, this would be the most ideal version to go with. Really quick, I'm just sort of gonna go through each of these again, and please just notice how different each of these district iterations look compared to each other. Again, this is keeping the cities intact. This is keeping the communities of interest intact. And this is keeping cities and communities of interest intact. So this is just something that the commissioners are all going to have to keep in mind, is this balance between keeping all of these geographies intact, the geographies that they receive from the census and the geographies that they receive from the community. And basically this is just a demonstration of all of these different variables that go into creating good districts that are gonna be responsive to community members and that are also going to be responsive to their criteria, that are their mandated criteria. I'm gonna take this label off because it's a little bit distracting. As we move on to our next criteria, which is compactness. So we've heard quite a bit about compactness from Mr. Levitt and from Ms. McDonald. And basically I feel like a large takeaway that we've heard from their presentations is sort of the eyeball test is a test that people have used to sort of talk about compactness in the past, and also looks aren't everything. So I'm going to take the highway layer off as well. And I would like to focus specifically on this district, which of course is not quite as exciting as the earmuffs district in that we saw the example from Chicago. But I do want to point to this because it's shaped like this. Looking at it, I could just hear everybody say, oh yeah, the shrimp district or something like that. It looks like a shrimp. And it does bypass this population right here, these towns, Los Altos and Loyola. However, I also would like to point out that it is keeping the town of Palo Alto together. So that is a reason for this boundary line. And it's also keeping this community of interest, Mountain View and Sunnyvale together, where perhaps adding these cities into this district would be either splitting Sunnyvale or Mountain View and potentially also splitting this community of interest. So just in terms of compactness, when it comes to actually mapping, there are usually many, many good reasons that that a district will not be like a perfect circle or a perfect square. And the commissioners will need to be able to understand that, and also will need to be able to explain that. It is, again, as Karin mentioned, it can be very, very strong visual cues that you're getting as a commissioner from the districts when you're looking at them and you're like, I can't believe this. This looks like a shrimp. When in fact there will be very, very good reasons to draw districts in a way that might not seem the most compact at first glance, and also keeping in mind that compactness is ranked lower than keeping cities and counties and COIs together, than equal population, and than any sort of race or ethnicity considerations that the commission will be needing to make. Okay, and last but not least, unless there are any questions, then I'm going to move on to nesting.
So I do have a question for you.
Yes.
So once the commission has identified community of interest and they've identified them by boundaries and input that into whatever their vendor's software program is, does the software program create options and ideals, or is a person sitting down and doing that? I know you were clicking on it, but does the software program create a suggestion that equalizes all these factors?
To my understanding, there are some software programs that will create districts that are equally populated. I don't know if they take communities of interest into consideration or not. However, I would say that to get the best districts, the commissioners will need to sort of weigh all of the factors that they have in mind, or I'm sorry, that they are given, and then also they'll get the best districts by hearing the input that is given to them and being able to sort of sort all of the input together and say, okay, I see that, you know, we could make a square here and that could be our district. But when I'm hearing all of the feedback from the community, for example, I'm seeing that these two cities, even though they're next door neighbors to each other, they don't necessarily belong in the same district together. And I think that there's no way that redistricting software can sort of take all of those complexities and all of those nuances and create districts that are going to be legal and also responsive to community. There's no way that a redistricting software could put sort of that human touch into creating districts.
Thank you. So we have a question from the public. Please state your name. Come to the microphone.
So I just want to follow up on your question. Operationally, what goes on? It's been mentioned that the commissioners have staff. So do staff create these options, or do the commissioners, tinker and do they have to have that kind of ability to explore and do the work the software and get the answers, or is that something staff does? And what's the personality of the commissioner and their ability to be, investigative? What's the need there?
Certainly. Another great question. Thank you. So the commissioners will hire line drawing consultants who will, at the commissioner's request or at the commissioner's direction, create drafts. So perhaps that would look like the commissioners conducting outreach, community outreach, and then directing their line drawers, try to make a draft that has equal population, takes all of our other criteria into effect. And for Santa Clara County, try and keep these cities together with this COI. See how the population plays out, and then come back to us with a draft that's equally balanced. And then depending on their process, then either live and in public, they can adjust the lines to make sense, or rather to be more responsive to what they think the community wants and is asking for. Or they could give further direction to their line drawing consultant to go home and try and work some stuff out according to the commission's feedback based on what they saw at the previous meeting. So the commissioners themselves most likely would not be using the mapping software, but they can direct their line drawers to create drafts that they feel are the best for the areas that they're working with. Does that answer your question?
So if I were a commissioner, I'd say, line drawer, let's get together tonight. I don't care if it comes to work till midnight. Let me sit over your shoulder and let's work on this together. Let's get it done. And I mean, is that allowed? Is that within the compass of what a commissioner does, or is that too micromanaging?
Right, yes. I would say that is a legal question. And I would also say that, so we've been talking about some of the traits that commissioners need to exhibit to really excel in this position and with this task. And I think that team collaboration among themselves would also is, as Karin mentioned, is something that's going to be necessary. So one commissioner sitting down with the line drawer and saying, do it like this, do it like this, do it like this, is not exactly acting in the name of collaboration or acting in a way that is very collaborative. And I would say that again, this is a legal question, and my guess would be that a draft that was created in that way might just be
Ms.
kinda-
Clark, if I might join in,
Yeah.
you are quite correct that it is a legal question, and I think it should be made clear that the commission itself decides how it will draw the lines under the authority that it is granted or that it is directed under the constitutional and statutory provisions. That they obviously will employ the consultants necessary to help them to do that, but they are charged with drawing the lines. And to the extent that they are receiving counsel and assistance from their staff, of course, they will use that to undertake their duties. But I think it should be made clear that the commission itself will be determining how the lines are drawn.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. So, Jamie, we have about 7 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So quickly, to talk about nesting, for these districts, it would be quite possible to, for example, nest this light blue district with the purple district, the yellow district and the green district together, and the red district and the dark blue district. We could probably hit all of our equal population marks. We know that the cities and COIs are intact in these districts, and so we wouldn't be replicating a split. We wouldn't be replicating a split in the city. However, I do want to turn our attention to these two communities of interest that we know are larger than an assembly district. So if we're talking about Senate districts, then the size of the Senate district, again, will be twice as large as that of the assembly districts. If we are just looking at this Silicon Valley community of interest and looking again at our draft that keeps all of our cities and communities of interest together, then we see that this community of interest was split into 4 different assembly districts. So no matter how we nest, this community of interest will still necessarily be in at least 2 different Senate districts. Moving on to this next Senate district, or excuse me, this next community of interest, Milpitas plus some areas in North San Jose. Again, we see that this community of interest is split into 4 different assembly districts. Again, if we try and do nesting, we're going to replicate a split for this community of interest. So the commission in this case would have the option to create Senate districts that are not nested. I'm going to show again, this draft. We can see just based on how messy these lines look, this is not a nested Senate draft. This draft was built to keep the Silicon Valley COI intact. We can see it is intact in 1 district. However, and this is something that certainly the commission will face, this area of Milpitas right here is shared between these 2 communities of interest. And so these 2 communities of interest in a certain way are at odds with each other to be intact in the Senate level plan. So you can see here that this community of interest is split in this version. However, the commission could also consider a second draft that keeps this community of interest intact and in 1 district. However, in this version, the Silicon Valley community of interest is again split. So this is just to say that the commission will almost certainly face an issue like this where there are communities of interest or other geographies that are, for lack of a better word, at odds with each other in terms of being able to be whole and intact in districts, and the commission will need to be able to sort of take a step back, weigh different options, and sort of weigh weigh the importance or what they assign as important in terms of which communities of interest, which cities, which counties to keep intact to the extent practicable. Sometimes multiple different, that could look like a lot of people from this North San Jose and Milpitas community of interest got together and they had a very compelling reason for why their community of interest should be kept together. And maybe it was a little bit more compelling than the Silicon Valley Koi. And so they're deciding to go with this version. Maybe from the Silicon Valley Koi, a lot of different people from a lot of different groups that have different interests all testified about the Silicon Valley Koi. Some people were tech workers who use similar transportation to get to their jobs. Some people were renters who were really concerned, who are not tech workers, who were really concerned that their rents had been going up and up and up, and they were concerned about their ability to continue living in that area for years to come. And so that's why they said they were a Koi. And so maybe the commission would say, okay, we've heard from all of these different people, all of these different groups, and so that's why this Koi is really strong. Another thing to consider while we're looking at this, if we could turn our attention again to the map. So again, this was the version that kept this community of interest intact versus this other draft, which is keeping the Silicon Valley Koi intact. So the commissioners also might want to look and say, okay, in this version, we're prioritizing keeping XYZ Koi intact. How does that play out for the rest of the map? What is the ripple effect? What is the impact that the rest of the map, that it's having on the rest of the map and the rest of the districts throughout the map? Versus, again, keeping the North San Jose Milpitas area intact. You can see this is a very different version from the previous map. So I know that we are out of time. I think, again, just sort of thinking about all of the different traits that the commissioners will need. They'll need to be impartial. A community of interest might emerge that is completely different than how they've been thinking about that area, but they'll need to be able to listen to the people who are speaking from that community of interest and be, again, impartial and flexible in how they're thinking about areas throughout California. Again, being responsive to community members that they're hearing from, and complex problem solving. As you can see, all of these criteria bring their own level of complexity to the redistricting process, and within each of the criteria, there are complexities within each of the complexities. So really having sort of a character that can sort of put all these little puzzle pieces together that will create really good puzzle pieces that are going to be the districts within the state of